Um, let's see, a few words on Sister Thea Bowman. She was a Franciscan sister of perpetual adoration. She attended Viterbo College in La Crosse, Wisconsin, while preparing to enter the convent. She earned an MA and a PhD at Catholic University in English, and went on to teach at elementary schools and later at Catholic University and Xavier University in New Orleans, Louisiana. She became a consultant for intercultural awareness for the Diocese of Mississippi, and her programs were designed to break down racial barriers and communication. She believed that communication and understanding of other cultures and ethnicities and racial injustice in that way could be minimized. Many felt that her efforts left a lasting mark on U.S. Catholic life in the 20th century, and she died of cancer in 1990. And the United States bishops endorsed her canonization to sainthood in 2018, and her case is continuing for approval. So this lecture is named after her, and this is the 6th lecture we've had in her name. And this year, we would like to present Dr. Paul Jaeger. So Paul Jaeger, a PhD, JD, MLS, MED, is a professor and distinguished scholar teacher at the College of Information, director of the Museum Scholarship and Material Cultural Certificate Program, and associate director of the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility at the University of Maryland. I'm sure most of you have heard of him, at least read his books. He has many, many books, and he studies the impacts of law and policy on information access and accessibility, focusing on human rights and civil rights. He is the author of more than 215 journal articles and book chapters, as well as 20 books. His recent books include Libraries and Global Retreat of Democracy and Foundations of Information Law. He is co-editors of the journals Library Quarterly, Including Disability, and co-founder and co-chair of the Including Disability Global Summit. And in 2014, he received the inaugural Library Journal Elise Excellence in Teaching Award. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Jaeger. Dr. Jaeger.
Thank you. And I'd actually just like to start by expressing my gratitude to being invited to give this talk. It's such an inspiring person behind the talk, and there've been such amazing people who have given this talk previously. It's a real honor. So I just thank you. As has been noted, we're going to be talking today about the intersection of libraries, disability, politics, and American history. And so on the second slide, I'd like to say a few things about where I'm coming from with this. First off, I am a disabled person, visually impaired my whole life. It's been a core focus of my career, but it's also going to play a little bit in how this presentation works. So you'll be hearing me say next slide or something like that as we go along as an indicator for Maria, who just introduced me, to advance the slides because she's kindly agreed to do that. And this is just it's worth noting because it's an interesting thing in terms of like how accessibility sometimes works and sometimes just is, confusing. So if you use a screen reader like I do, and you're giving a presentation and you're running the presentation, your screen reader will be saying things while you're trying to talk. And if you're clever, you can make that work. If you're like me, you might wind up in an argument with the screen reader. So that's why we're doing it this way. And it's also worth mentioning that within disability, there are a huge number of terminological variations. What people individually, by types of population, by geography, the language of disability varies. And so some people, it's very important that it's person first, that is, person with a disability. Some people, it's very important that the disability part comes first, disabled person to indicate it's a social structure being put upon someone. So I just mention this because it's always worth noting that when you talk about disability issues, being respectful of however the individual, the group is using the terminology and reflecting that is a very kind thing to be doing. So on our next slide, we're going to start into a bit of context of disability because weirdly, it's the largest minority population in the US, but it's also invisible in a lot of ways, or at least often forgotten about. So depending on which federal agency you ask, it's somewhere between 22 and 26% of the population, which is, again, the largest minority population in the US. It's a lot of people. It's also unique because it's a legally defined membership. So you have to meet certain legally defined thresholds to qualify, which makes it unique among protected minority populations under the law. You also amazingly can be too disabled in some cases for protection under the law, which is also very unique. Disability is also about as diverse an identified population you could possibly have, because disability as a group is defined by having something that causes a limitation on a major life function. So that can be walking, that can be breathing, that can be hearing. Those all have the similar limitation part, but they are limitations of different things. So as a lived experience, it can be incredibly different for two people who are both part of this population. It's also the only minority population that intersects with every other population. There are disabled people in every other group. Nobody else can claim that. And it's also the only population that everyone has the potential to join. If you say you and your partner both live to 70, odds are by that point, at least one of you will officially qualify. And yet for all of this, when we talk about pretty much any issues, disability is often forgotten, even in the context of rights and justice. So as we see on the next slide, it's also really important to go into any discussion of disability, remembering that it is a social construct. Society rewards some differences very positively and views others negatively. A very simple way of thinking about this is if you happen to be, say, 7 feet 2 inches tall, that's not typical, but it is often rewarded with a professional basketball contract. So there are differences that are very rare that get fame and money because you're tall and you can put a ball through a hoop. But there's a lot of differences that get viewed negatively because society has deemed it that way. But difference is part of the range of human existence and always has been. Archaeology has found many examples of burials of people, tens of thousands of years ago with some very primordial assistive device, like a wooden crutch or something. So disability has always been. And it's also worth remembering, we think of the word accommodation when it's an unusual thing. But literally everything around you is an accommodation. Whether or not it's a standard one or not is the only difference. If you walked into a building and it had no chairs, you would be really confused, unless you're someone who, say, always travels in their own chair. So for most people, chairs are an accommodation that are an invisible accommodation. And it's also just worth remembering when we think of accommodations and assistive technologies, they often have much wider benefits. So, excuse me, like your mobile device that you carry with you all the time has many features in it that began as assistive technologies, including the phone part, the touch screen part. So assistive technologies can benefit everybody. And on the next slide, one other aspect, and I do promise the whole presentation won't just be context. Disability also includes thinking about the extra taxes on disabled people. So you're probably familiar with the terms like pink tax and black tax that indicate that people in certain groups, through social pressures, through economic pressures, pay more emotionally, financially. And in disability, there's actually two taxes. The disability tax is the more familiar one. The idea of inherent discrimination, being required to provide value beyond the position, the inability to decline extra work assigned to you, assumptions of able-bodiedness limiting what you can do. But there's also an accessibility tax, which comes from acquiring, navigating, affording the extra things you need. Like if your work does not provide the assistive software you need, or your school doesn't, or it does, but you still have to learn it, and it's extra effort. And again, disability is the one population you have to prove you're a member of, so it's documentation and disclosure. So if you're interested in this idea, some friends and I actually wrote a very long article on this. That's the link there. So that's context. Now history. So on the next slide is a very, very, very short bit of how hatred has heavily shaped how disabled people are treated historically in the U.S. When the U.S. was actually a set of colonies, bans on disabled people were actually a common thing. Like, you weren't allowed to even enter the colony, much less think of staying. And the first person who tried to change this, I think, is always worth remembering because it was really brave and unexpected. So in the 1690s, the first disability rights advocate in the not the US yet was a man by the name of Philip Nelson, who eventually had to flee because he was going to be, he was being accused of witchcraft, actually, for, yeah. So that seems worth remembering. After the US became the US, what happened were things called ugly laws, which is an umbrella term which basically said that disabled people were upsetting, so they should not be allowed out, hence the ugly part, but that extended to outright bans on like working or going to school. I mean, it was very comprehensive. By the time about 1900 had rolled around, the US got really excited about an idea called eugenics. And that was from Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, who, much to Darwin's chagrin, decided survival of the fittest concept would also be great in application to humans. And so the US interpreted that idea that it would be a great idea to keep disabled people from breeding. So many states and territories enacted laws that permitted sterilization or lobotomization of disabled people, as well as related bans on marriage, having children, being employed, educated, being present in public spaces. 100 years ago, more than 80% of states and territories had eugenics laws on the books. Many of them were never removed, not enforced now, but they're still there. And the Supreme Court, even in a case called Buck v. Bell, gave the thumbs up to this as a great idea. That case has also never been overturned. So another thing about disability that's really important is in the current context, it's often not realized that when you're talking statistics about populations, it's often like in a really bad position statistically, but maybe not noticed. And so these are representative, but not all of them. And you see problems affecting employment, pay, education, internet access, poverty levels, healthcare. This is a lot of negatives against any population. And on the next slide, it's also worth noting, and I promise we'll be getting to libraries in just a minute, but mocking and denigrating disability is so socially ingrained, it's often not even noticed. So many common insults are former medical terms or terms that were invented just to denigrate disabled people that have gained broader currency. In politics, rhetoric often uses disability as a shorthand for other negative things, or just feels free to say negative things about disabled people. It's a space where it's totally cool for people elected to office to be openly resistant to legal rights for this population. And then finally, disability erasure is a form of cultural erasure, but it's very pervasive. To the point that even when you see books written like the multicultural history of the US, the inclusive history of the US, it's inevitable that disability won't make it into the book as part of that broad inclusive history. So it's disability is erased, and it's not noticed that it's erased most of the time. So with all of that in mind, on the next slide, we get to libraries. And so the broad point underlying the relationship between libraries and disabled people is libraries are amazing. And I realize I'm in the field. I've devoted my life to the field. I am biased, but I am convinced, and I've written a lot about this, so I'm truly convinced that libraries are the best social institution of rights and justice that have ever been created. And it is not always that we as a field have been on the right side of history, at least as soon as we should have been. Like the burning of materials by German authors during World War I by libraries is not great. Segregated public library systems in the Jim Crow South, also not great. Basically everything Melville Dewey did, not great. I mean, we are not flawless by any means. But if you compare our institutions and our profession to everyone else, we've been doing good longer and better. And if you don't buy this point, I will understand, but I would just ask you to think about things like children's story time, the origins of which were helping immigrant children learn English while their parents were in another part of the library learning job skills. Homework help. The fact that we provide internet training and access as a social safety net that no one asked us to do, we just figured out, hey, somebody should do that. Job seeking, newcomer support, small business help, library collections of things that are things. Cake pans, tools, musical instruments, costumes. The students in your community who are on free and reduced lunch program in the summer are hungry. The libraries decide, hey, we can help. You have an overdose problem in your city. City officials decide, oh, the librarians can help. We're the go-to source for information literacy, as well as books, databases, and all of the stuff that we're technically around to provide. So on the next slide, we're going to get into a little bit on the disability part of why libraries are amazing. So this is, I can't really understate how amazing this is. If you think back to the point of the commonality of the ugly laws and the eugenics laws, libraries instead discovered that, well, disabled people in their community were actually people. There are a bunch of New England libraries that have more than 200 years of providing collections in alternate formats. When Braille started up, it was quickly something libraries got into. By 1900, in school and public libraries in cities, alternate format collections were actually standard. The reading room in the Library of Congress for the blind opened around 1900, as did the ALA's first Committee on Disability Services. Continuing on the next slide, about that same time, state libraries start being created for disabled patrons. And 1930-ish, the National Library Service was established to better distribute alternate format materials. Excuse me. In 1961, the ALA offered unequivocal requirements of service to disabled patrons and clear standards for collections. By 1970, it was reflected pretty much universally in mission statements and policies. And just, this is not the subject of the talk, but just the being on the right side of things context. 1970 is also when the ALA formed its first committee related to LGBTQ issues, way ahead of like everyone else. But it's also worth noting at this point, disabled people had no legal rights. So on the next slide, the title of the slide is not hyperbole. There were civil rights laws for disabled people starting around 1970, but they weren't implemented. The 3 presidents tried to block them in succession. Nixon vetoed them, Congress overruled him, then he sat on them. Ford sat on them. Carter was strongly opposed to them. So just a side note, when everyone talks glowingly about his great humanitarianism and such, the only reason they were implemented is disabled people did a whole bunch of really impressive public protests, including blockading the driveways of cabinet officials and in San Francisco, taking over a government building. That got that got the laws implemented finally. And the coalition of groups who actually helped the disabled activists in these protests was really phenomenal, to the point of, like, you had Safeway grocery stores supporting them, you had the Black Panthers supporting them. It was a lot of groups and companies recognized how important that was. But even those laws in the 70s, when they were finally implemented, actually only covered government and education. So it took until 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, signed by the first President George Bush, was the first comprehensive rights for disabled Americans, but it was the first bill of its nature anywhere in the world. So a lot of other nations followed the lead of the US, but a great many have not, and courts in the US started nibbling away at it instantaneously. The law was actually fairly restricted from its original intent just the next year by the Supreme Court. So, on the next slide, we go back to the library. And in this time period, when the laws were happening, libraries were jumping from basically, strength and innovation in relation to disability. So, moving from print to talking books on records, tapes, discs, and digital files. Devices that are now commonly built into technologies, but originally were really innovative standalone things like enlargement, readers, voice navigation, talk to text, and born digital services. When you saw studies of websites, when that was a new thing, back mid-1990s, libraries would always come in just doing better than every other sector. And since then, that's been consistent. And then there's also innovation. Like the increasingly common procurement policies that require things to be accessible is something that libraries have been pushing for a long time. Things like makerspaces, which help educate everybody, but that offer really neat new things specifically for disabled patrons. Expanding the idea of story time for different types, different disabilities. Really localized things, but just amazing, like a library system, and this is real. Being asked to teach sign language courses for the other local government employees so everyone in the community actually could communicate in ASL. Or projects like specifically working to get the disabled members of the community a chance to get registered and get to the polls for voting. And all of this is not just access and accessibility, it's also education. Because having all these things means you're teaching people how to use them if they haven't before. So on the next slide, these are just some current library guidelines. Good starting point if you're wondering what can this entail. The Los Angeles Public Library System is there because it's just got a really good, easy to find policy as an example of how you might implement it. Giant old system, but it's very findable and very clear. On the next slide is the one thing that doesn't go well with this for us, which is talking about it. Now, this is kind of a general problem for libraries. You've probably seen studies that point out that regular patrons of libraries are often unfamiliar with the range of services in the library they use all the time. We have a tendency to use language that is maybe sensible to us, but not so much to people outside the field. We have a long history of framing things more as assertion than demonstration. So we're great rather than we're great because reasons and data.
Thank you.
We often allow public discourse to be about a specific thing rather than services or ideals. And we're really kind of scared of using the terminology of rights that is so central to what we do in talking about what we do. And that includes the work we do with disability as well. So by not talking about the ways in which libraries have uniquely included and welcomed disabled people, it kind of impacts and limits how effective that is. People in the community who would benefit may not know because it's not talked about as much as it could be. people who aren't disabled but are in the community might actually be positively affected in terms of, oh, learning more. So, you know, being more vocal about these sorts of things could help undercut the biases that were all part of the social context bit. This is a really cool bit of our history. And I found by talking about this over and over, a lot of people in our field have no idea, like, hey, we've been leading and helping this very large population for a couple centuries. I mean, that's neat. And this kind of support is especially important right now, for reasons that you may already have intuited. So returning to the politics of hatred thing, there is admittedly a lot of it to go around. But disabled people are a favorite target of the past and pending president. His 2016 campaign book title should have gotten more attention than it did, because he actually made the title a disability slur. And then he uses them in his talk fairly regularly to diminish anyone who's not disabled who he doesn't like. He tends to link disability to criminality, you know, in a guns don't kill people, disabled people kill people sort of way. And when he's confronted with actual disabilities, he dismisses them. So rhetorically, this is all bad, but worse is that in his first term, it became policy. So on the next slide, you know, you always have to admit past, not necessarily prologue, but some highlights related to disability from the first Trump administration included taking away resources and guidance, canceling and defunding programs, proposing federal budgets eliminating funding for all kinds of things, a Secretary of Education who actually, in her confirmation hearings, admitted she didn't support federal laws requiring states to educate disabled students. Though in her favor, compared to the announcement of today, she actually did not come from professional wrestling. So there was that in her favor. And a gift of a Supreme Court justice who actually is on record that disability rights laws need to be enforced as minimally as possible. And also the party that now controls the White House and both parts of Congress, a decent chunk of them want to repeal the ADA entirely. And who knows, but it doesn't seem impossible at this moment that something like that could happen. So we can kind of intuit the second term is probably going to be hard on disabled people, but it's also probably going to be a garland of tears for libraries. Also in his first term, the White House budget every year called for eliminating all federal funds for libraries, archives, museums, literacy, you know. Congress wouldn't go along with it, but hey, very different makeup of Congress now. So who knows? And then also the whole censorship, book ban, jailing librarians agenda. A lot of the people who are invested in that are, you know, now in Congress. So again, no guarantees of this, but it could be an interesting ride for both libraries and people with disabilities. And the next slide, the term responsibility rolls down, I had a hand in coining as a way of describing government activities so frequently winding up in the hands of libraries, whether or not we said, hey, we'd like to do that. And that's because there's a long history in the US of just government agencies doing that. Like way back when federal agencies first started creating websites, they had the clever idea of just putting a note on them somewhere. If you're having trouble understanding things on this website, go to your nearest library. Libraries were not informed of this, of course. And also the genuine goodness of our field wanting to solve problems that no one else is trying to solve. And so that comes into play here. You could very much look at what I just set out and say, okay, we're facing too much, there's not enough funding, there's never enough funding, how do we handle this? But the thing is, with disabled people, libraries have been about the best social ally they've had, but that also is true for a bunch of populations that aren't the topic of this talk. And so one thing I want to remember, or want you to remember on this next slide, even though it's weird to quote yourself, I've never found a better way to say this. We are clever, we are adaptable, and we are dedicated to the public good, even when there is not much interest in either the public or the good. And again, it's weird to quote yourself, but at the same time, this is really a good way of saying this. So on the next slide, thinking about how under trying circumstances you can be there for your disabled community members. Think born accessible. That means think about the accessibility of everything from the beginning. It saves work and time and cost to make it as whatever it is, a program, a space, a collection, as inclusive as possible from the beginning. And there's piles of studies showing that if you make things accessible for disabled people, it actually works better for everyone else. And the neat thing is, the people who don't need the accessible stuff get a better experience and don't even notice the accessibility components. Hence the idea of born accessible. So if you think equity in everything, it just is a way of making things work better for everyone. And disabled patrons and staff members are sources of knowledge. And I don't say this like, excuse me, putting more responsibilities on them. It's a sense of seeking input and listening and being creative when they offer ideas. If you get new ways of thinking about something, figure out, okay, how can we do this? Because really, when you come down to it, this unique history between libraries and disability is a form of advocacy, and an essential form of advocacy. We tend to limit, and by here I mean we as in sort of an everybody sense, tends to think first of advocacy as being about politics or policy. But if you are working to make things fairer for a community member by teaching them how to use the internet for the first time and all the possible things that will benefit in their life because of that. If you are building programs for a group of people in your community who things aren't equitable for now, but you're trying to fix that. Making things more fair, making things more just, making your community more compassionate is about the greatest form of advocacy there is. And that is inextricably linked to what our institutions and the people in our field do. So this long relationship is also a way of seeing this inherent part of what our institutions do and a way to act it to help a lot of people in your community. We'll end quickly with just some potentially useful things. There are some recent books that are very relevant here, admitting the bias of having a hand in two of them, but there are neat resources out there for clever ideas for working in this space. There's also a couple journals that exist of fairly recent vintage that are free online journals that can offer lots of useful things and ideas when you're thinking about disability. And again, with admitting biases, I also had a hand in creating both of those journals. So again, I'm not impartial, but at the same time, they were created for these reasons. And there are lots and lots and lots of resources from government agencies and non-governmental organizations and international organizations. And these are just some representative ones. You can find lots of great resources out there when you're thinking of a new program or a new service or a new space or, you know, anything you come up with. Government agencies, disability rights groups, standards organizations may have tools and resources and ideas. So I thank you very much for coming and listening to this. I also thank you for listening through my somewhat questionable voice at this point. In a case of really bad timing, I actually got sick a couple days ago, and my voice has been in and out. So I apologize for that, and I, you know, I'm sorry if you heard me coughing a few times, but I've done my best. So I will be happy to answer questions as best I can if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jaeger. Sobering and inspiring. And while it's never inappropriate to talk about these things, it's more appropriate than ever right now, I think. And I think you underscored that. With that, I think we should take some questions. Let's see. Okay, so it looks like a lot of the questions are in the chat. Is that true, Professor Suyan?
There's some comments going on the chat.
I don't see any in the QA, so let me see. Maybe I'll just go from the chat. Are you seeing any in the Q&A?
I think it should be available.
Okay.
Stephanie Cork asked whether should we pitch our special issues? Was asking for the poll.
Let's see. Hi, Maria. There's a bunch of.
I think the Q&A now is available. It had a different setting, so it should be available if you have any questions to share.
Okay, yes, please put your questions into the Q&A. You can do that right now.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, I will, the note from Stephanie that just got read was pointing out that I mentioned the journal Including Disability that just posted yesterday, the day before, a call for papers for a special issue on what does the 2024 election mean for disability. So if you're interested in these issues enough to attend the talk and you think, hey, I have something to say on that, you know, go to the Including Disability site and check out the special issue call, because this is a conversation we need to have not only in our field, but with other fields as well. And between what we know, what we've done, what we try to do, maybe those lessons can be helpful for other fields as, you know, the next few years happen.
Okay, I'm going to go from some of the questions that are in the chat here. Good morning, Jelena Haynes joining from Australia. Disability, invisible disability are often viewed as a burden to the system rather than partner co-designer in shaping their lives. A point was made there, no question though. The slides will be available. We will share the lecture. Dr. Jaeger, your speaking voice was engaging and enjoyable, even though it was affected by your cold, just so you know, someone said that. This is a question from Babak Zarin. First, thank you for doing this as someone who works in a public library, specifically as an access services librarian, as a talking books librarian. I feel the lack of knowledge deeply. My question for you is, how do you see us continuing to develop services for this community in years to come? Is there any trend or program or such that's caught your eye?
Well, first off, I feel like for the person from Australia, yes, I have to admit this has been a very U.S.-centric talk, and I apologize for, there's only so much could be covered in the time span, but yes, there are different issues with this and different approaches in different spaces, and also the overall goodness in libraries in the U.S., of course, is not 100% consistent. So it's been, this has been about the U.S. field generally, and I should have emphasized that more at the beginning. So I apologize for that. But, and I also thank you for whoever said that it was at least tolerable to listen through my coughing. As far as the, what's next? I mean, there's been so much amazing opportunity with technology. Having lived growing up as someone when you got talking books in the mail, and they were these weird 4-track cassettes that needed their own player. And if you put them in a normal cassette player, everything sounded like Alvin and the Chipmunks. The change from, we were still getting those tapes like in the 2000s. So the acceleration from that to discs, which were so much more manageable. And I'm not old enough to have been in school when you would have gotten your talking books in like a box of LPs, which I cannot imagine how awful that would have been to deal with. So moving from discs then to digital files has been, from just the pure access side, such an amazing change. And so, as a lived experience, so the possibilities of continuing to find ways to use technology to bring access to things that aren't accessible now or aren't readily accessible, I think is genuinely exciting. The creativity of building out and, of new spaces so they work for people they haven't worked for before. The reason why I love that the continuing thing about libraries in the US being the group that have always had the most accessible websites is that goes back to the early days of the internet. And that was when most people weren't even paying attention to the idea of website accessibility, and libraries were naturally doing it. And that was making the primordial internet available to people it wouldn't be available to otherwise. So I guess for me, that's always the hope, is making programs, making spaces, making technologies available in ways they aren't And it's just the opportunities with the technology to bring people in ways that would be impossible for a lot of kinds of disabilities otherwise is just such a compelling possibility as, you know, as we go forward.
Thank you. We have another question from Lauren Martino. When you put work and thought into creating programs and accommodations for people with disabilities and no one comes or they're not used, what are your next steps?
I would suggest thinking about how are the programs advertised? How are the communities you're hoping to engage engaged? How are you making them available? Is when you're making them available fit with the group you're trying to reach? You know, programs don't always click. I mean, whoever you're trying to reach out to, I mean, that's just one of the things that can happen. And so thinking through, you know, how you get the word out to the right people and make it fit for what works for them. And, you know, if there's the chance to involve members of that community in planning it in the first place, you know, that can make a world of difference if people have the chance to be invested earlier than when it first appears, but that also helps to get the word out. If you're working with a community organization that many of the members people you're trying to reach are members of or supported by or going to get information from, you can reach people through channels that the library doesn't have.
And we have another question in the chat from Agnieszka Heller. What are your thoughts on the struggle of rural libraries to disability inclusive and to be a disability inclusive and accessible?
I think first off, with anything with rural libraries is to start with just nothing but admiration for them and what they do manage to do. You know, if you're not in a rural context and don't know people working in a rural context, the kinds of things a public library has to work with might be, you know, just a handful of hours of operation every week, one half-time employee being the whole staff, being in the back of a government building, not being given the money to create a online public access catalog, so the librarian has to tell people if things exist via Twitter or something. So in the kinds of constraints that are there for so many rural libraries, there are challenges for reaching everyone. And I don't have a good answer to that. You know, there are all kinds of resources out there that I pointed to that can help you make things work better for disabled people. And if you don't have help with that in your local community, if there are no organizations, but you still have community members that you want to help, looking for resources from those, you know, ideas from those sorts of resources, it is at least free. Looking for, maybe there are state grant programs, maybe there are, you know, non-government agencies that provide grants that are relevant in your community or state. And then just the basic idea of doing things from the born accessible standpoint of when you do get the chance to make something new or buy something new, make sure it works as much for everyone as much as possible from the outset when you get the chance to do things and buy things. So again, I don't have a good magic answer on that one, but it's admittedly a space where our whole field really should pay a lot more attention to rural librarianship and the unique challenges there than it does.
Well, Dr. Jaeger, we have several notes of thanks from people who have attended the talk, and we would like to thank you immensely. It's just about 7 o'clock right now. It was a very interesting talk, and let's hope the language of human rights in libraries starts to stick again, and in general, as it relates to disabilities and in other places. You talked a little bit about that. That was interesting, but thank you very much. And it'll take forever for us to read all of your work, but we certainly know where to find your work. And you're a leader in your field, and we appreciate it.
Well, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I very greatly appreciate what you do, what you're doing with this talk and its ideals, and I'm grateful for everyone who came to listen. So thank you.
Thank you.